Jake Morrison floated in the darkness of space inside his small escape pod and watched the pieces of his ship drift past the tiny window. The New Horizon had been a beautiful colony ship just 3 hours ago, but now it was nothing but twisted metal and broken dreams scattered across the void. The Zephyrian raiders had come out of nowhere and torn through their defenses like they were made of paper. His oxygen gauge showed red, and the communication system had died during the attack, so Jake knew he was probably going to die alone in the cold emptiness between stars. He had maybe 6 hours of air left and no way to call for help, because Earth was too far away and there were no other human ships in this sector of space. Jake closed his eyes and tried not to think about his sister Lucy, back home on Mars, who was probably wondering why his last message had been so cheerful when he told her about the new planet they were going to colonize. He tried not to think about Captain Stevens, who had pushed him toward the escape pods when the Zephyrian boarding parties had breached the hull, or about the 300 families who had been sleeping in their cryopods when the attack began. A shadow passed across his window, and Jake opened his eyes expecting to see another piece of debris, but instead he saw the hull of a ship. It was not like any ship he had ever seen because it was made of some kind of crystal material that seemed to glow with its own inner light, and it moved through space without making any noise that his sensors could detect. The crystal ship stopped next to his escape pod, and Jake watched through his window as a section of the hull seemed to melt away to form an opening. A beam of soft blue light reached out from the ship and grabbed his pod like a gentle hand pulling him inside, and Jake felt his heart beating faster because he did not know if these aliens were going to help him or hurt him. When the light pulled his pod inside the crystal ship, Jake found himself in a chamber filled with more of that strange glowing material, and he could see figures moving around outside his pod, but they did not look human at all. They were tall and thin like living crystals with bodies that seemed to be made of the same glowing material as their ship, and when they moved, the light inside them pulsed in different colors. One of the crystal beings approached his pod, and Jake could hear a voice in his head even though the alien was not speaking out loud. The voice was soft and musical like wind chimes in a gentle breeze, and it said his name even though he had never met these creatures before. Jake Morrison of the human species, the voice said, and somehow he knew it belonged to the crystal being standing closest to his pod. I am Captain Veltar of the Kethmori people, and we mean you no harm, but your life signs show you are in danger, so please allow us to help you. Jake did not know how to respond because he had never heard of the Kethmori before, and he had no idea how Captain Veltar knew his name, or how she was speaking directly into his mind. But his oxygen was almost gone, so he pressed the emergency release button on his pod and hoped these aliens were as friendly as they claimed to be. The moment his pod opened, Jake felt the clean air of the crystal ship fill his lungs, and he realized that Captain Veltar and her crew had somehow adjusted their atmosphere to keep him alive. Another crystal being approached him, and this one moved with the careful grace of someone trained in medicine, and Jake heard another voice in his head introducing herself as Dr. Zara, who would take care of his injuries. Dr. Zara led Jake through corridors that seemed to be carved from living crystal, and every surface glowed with soft rainbow colors that pulsed in rhythm with the ship itself. She brought him to a medical bay where crystal formations grew from the walls like frozen waterfalls, and Jake lay down on a bed that felt warm against his back while Dr. Zara examined him with instruments that looked like they were made of crystallized light. Your species is new to us, the doctor said as she worked, and her mental voice was gentler than Captain Veltar's, with notes of curiosity and kindness mixed together. We have never seen a human before, but your body is similar enough to ours that we can help heal the damage you have suffered from your ordeal. Jake watched the crystal beings work around him, and noticed that they moved with a sadness that seemed to weigh down their glowing forms like they were carrying a great burden. When he asked Captain Veltar about it, she showed him images in his mind of mining colonies and prison camps, where millions of Kethmori worked under the brutal control of Zephyrian overseers. We are slaves, Jake Morrison, Captain Veltar explained, and her mental voice grew heavy with sorrow. For 300 years our people have been forced to mine the crystals that power Zephyrian ships and weapons, and those who resist are killed as examples to the others. My crew and I were sent to salvage materials from battle sites like this. But when we saw your escape pod, we could not leave you to die alone. Jake felt anger building in his chest as he learned about the suffering of these gentle beings who had risked their lives to save a complete stranger. He asked why they had helped him when discovery by the Zephyrians would mean death for them and their families, and Captain Veltar's response was simple and honest. Because it was the right thing to do, she said, and the crystals in her body pulsed with warm golden light. In our hearts we believe that all thinking beings deserve to live free, and we hoped that if we were ever in need, someone would help us as we have helped you. Your people would do the same, would they not? Jake looked around at the crystal beings who had saved his life and thought about everything Captain Veltar had shown him about their enslaved people, and he made a promise that would change the course of history. He told Captain Veltar that humans would indeed help, and that if he ever made it back to Earth, he would make sure his people knew about the Kethmori and their suffering under Zephyrian rule. The crystal ship continued through space toward a hidden way station where Jake could find passage back to human territory, and during the journey he learned about Kethmori culture and their hope for freedom. When they finally parted, Captain Veltar gave Jake a small crystal that would prove his story was true, and she made him promise to remember their kindness. Jake Morrison promised that humanity would never forget the Kethmori, who had saved one human when they could have left him to die in the darkness of space. Jake Morrison stood in the Great Assembly Hall of the United Earth Defense Council in Geneva and felt the weight of 3 billion human eyes watching him through the holographic broadcast network that connected every world in human space. 3 months had passed since Captain Veltar and her crew had saved his life, and Jake had spent every day of those months preparing for this moment when he would tell humanity about the Kethmori and their desperate need for help. The crystal that Captain Veltar had given him sat on the podium beside him, glowing with soft rainbow light that proved his story was real and not some fantasy born from trauma and oxygen deprivation. The scientists had studied the crystal for weeks and confirmed that its technology was beyond anything humans had ever seen, while the xenobiologists had analyzed the genetic samples from his rescue and verified that the Kethmori were indeed a real species. Admiral Kate Sullivan sat in the front row of the assembly hall, and her weathered face showed the same expression Jake had seen on veteran soldiers throughout the galaxy when they heard about injustice and suffering. Next to her sat President Carol Washington, whose political career had been built on the principle that Earth would never again stand by while innocent beings suffered under tyranny and oppression. Jake began his testimony by describing the attack on the New Horizon and the destruction of 300 families who had only wanted to build new lives on a distant world. He talked about floating in his escape pod with death approaching and the miracle of Captain Veltar's ship appearing out of nowhere to save a stranger they had never met before. The holographic displays around the assembly hall showed the star maps that Captain Veltar had shared with Jake during his recovery, including the locations of 12 prison colonies where billions of Kethmori worked in mining operations that extracted the rare crystals powering Zephyrian war machines. The tactical analysis showed that the Zephyrian Empire controlled a vast sector of space with military technology that matched or exceeded human capabilities in most areas. Dr. Amy Chen rose from her seat in the scientific section and asked Jake about Kethmori physiology and whether human medical supplies would be effective in treating their injuries. Jake described Dr. Zara's kindness and the way Kethmori bodies processed energy through their crystalline structure, and Dr. Chen began taking notes about developing specialized medicines that could help the alien prisoners. Captain Ben Rodriguez of the cargo hauler Liberty Bell interrupted the formal proceedings to announce that he and dozens of other merchant captains were already organizing supply runs to the border regions where they might be able to help Kethmori refugees escape from Zephyrian territory. The announcement caused a stir in the assembly hall as other humans began volunteering their ships and resources for rescue missions. Admiral Sullivan called for order and reminded the assembly that any unauthorized military action could trigger a war that humanity was not prepared to fight. The Zephyrian Empire had shown its willingness to destroy entire colony ships, and their fleet strength was estimated to be 3 times larger than the combined human naval forces. Jake felt frustration building in his chest as he listened to the debate that followed Admiral Sullivan's warning, because he could see that some members of the council were looking for reasons to avoid helping the Kethmori. Senator Richard Barnes from the Centauri colonies argued that humanity had just finished rebuilding from the last war and could not afford another conflict so soon, while Representative Lisa Park from the Mars Defense Forces worried that helping the Kethmori would make Earth a target for Zephyrian expansion. President Washington called for a closed session, and Jake was asked to wait in an adjoining chamber while the council debated humanity's response to his testimony. Through the walls, he could hear voices raised in argument as supporters of military action clashed with those who favored diplomatic solutions or complete neutrality in the conflict between the Zephyrians and their slaves. Dr. Torres, the head linguist for the diplomatic corps, came to speak with Jake while he waited, and she asked detailed questions about Kethmori language and culture because she wanted to establish communication protocols if the council decided to make contact with the imprisoned aliens. Jake taught her the basic greeting that Captain Veltar had shown him and described the way Kethmori used color patterns in their crystalline bodies to express emotions and intentions. Hours passed before President Washington emerged from the closed session with Admiral Sullivan and the other council leaders following behind her. Jake could tell from their expressions that the debate had been difficult and that the decision they had reached would change the course of human history. President Washington explained that the council had voted to authorize Operation Homecoming, a massive military and humanitarian mission to liberate the Kethmori prison colonies and offer the freed aliens sanctuary on human worlds. The operation would be led by Admiral Sullivan and would involve the largest fleet deployment in human history with support from civilian volunteers and medical personnel. Jake felt relief wash over him as he realized that humanity was going to keep the promise he had made to Captain Veltar, but President Washington was not finished speaking. She explained that the mission would be dangerous and that many humans might die in the attempt to free beings they had never met, and Jake wondered if he had the right to ask his species to risk so much for aliens they knew nothing about. Admiral Sullivan must have seen the doubt in Jake's expression because she approached him and placed a hand on his shoulder, while explaining that the council's decision had not been based on obligation or guilt, but on the fundamental values that defined humanity's place among the stars. She told Jake that every human who had heard his story had asked the same question that he had asked himself in that crystal ship. If we walk away now that we know about their suffering, Admiral Sullivan said then, what kind of people are we? And what right do we have to call ourselves civilized? The Kethmori saved one human when they could have left you to die, and now that we know they exist, we cannot pretend we do not have a responsibility to help them. Jake looked around the assembly hall at the faces of humans from dozens of worlds who had volunteered their lives and resources to help aliens they had never seen, and he realized that Captain Veltar had been right when she said that humans would do the same thing the Kethmori had done. The species that had reached for the stars despite countless failures and setbacks would not abandon friends who had shown them kindness in their darkest hour. Operation Homecoming would begin within 6 months, and Jake Morrison would be part of the mission that would either free 12 billion enslaved aliens or start a war that could destroy both human and Kethmori civilizations forever. The shipyards above Mars had never seen anything like the construction program that began after President Washington authorized Operation Homecoming, and every day brought new vessels rolling out of the fabrication bays while thousands of workers labored around the clock to prepare humanity's largest military deployment. Admiral Kate Sullivan stood on the observation deck of the orbital station and watched the fleet taking shape before her eyes as cargo haulers were converted into troop transports and civilian ships received weapon systems that could punch through Zephyrian armor. The problem that kept Admiral Sullivan awake at night was not the size of the enemy fleet or the advanced technology of Zephyrian weapons, but the fact that 12 billion Kethmori prisoners were scattered across a dozen star systems in heavily fortified mining colonies where a direct assault would result in massive civilian casualties. The Zephyrians had designed their prison camps to make rescue impossible by surrounding the mining operations with energy shields that would kill every Kethmori worker if the installations came under attack. Commander Lisa Park had spent her entire career in special operations, and she understood better than anyone how difficult it would be to liberate prisoners who were being used as human shields by their captors. She worked with Jake Morrison and a team of tactical experts to develop a plan that could free the Kethmori without getting them all killed in the process, and after weeks of analysis they concluded that the only solution was to coordinate simultaneous uprisings on all 12 worlds. The plan required small teams of human commandos to infiltrate each prison colony and work with Kethmori resistance cells to disable the energy shields and security systems at exactly the same moment across 12 different star systems. The timing had to be perfect because if even one facility remained operational, the Zephyrians could use their communication networks to warn the other colonies and trigger the execution of millions of prisoners. Engineer Danny Hayes received the assignment of adapting human technology for use by Kethmori physiology, and he quickly discovered that the crystalline aliens interacted with energy fields in ways that made standard human equipment completely useless. He spent months in the research labs developing specialized communication devices that could interface with Kethmori neural patterns and weapons that could be operated by beings whose bodies were made of living crystal rather than flesh and bone. The communication problem was especially challenging because Kethmori thoughts operated on frequencies that human technology could barely detect, and their emotional states were expressed through color patterns that required completely new translation protocols. Dr. Eva Torres worked with Danny Hayes to create universal translators that could convert human speech into the harmonic frequencies that Kethmori used for long-distance communication. Captain Ryan Foster led the intelligence division that had the most dangerous job of all because his people had to establish contact with Kethmori resistance movements inside the prison colonies, without alerting Zephyrian security forces to the planned rescue operation. Every message sent to the imprisoned aliens carried the risk of exposure, and exposure meant torture and death not just for the resistance fighters, but for their families and friends. Jake Morrison served as the primary liaison between human forces and Kethmori contacts because he was the only human that the crystalline aliens trusted completely, and his presence in communications helped convince skeptical resistance leaders that the rescue operation was real and not some Zephyrian trick designed to identify prisoners who were planning rebellion. Jake spent hours each day in the communication centers talking with Kethmori leaders across 12 star systems and coordinating plans for the massive uprising that would begin when the human fleet arrived. The most difficult part of the preparation was maintaining secrecy while building a fleet large enough to challenge Zephyrian military forces across multiple star systems simultaneously. Admiral Sullivan knew that Zephyrian intelligence agents were probably watching human shipyards and troop movements, so she had to disguise Operation Homecoming as a routine military exercise involving fleet training and equipment testing. Dr. Amy Chen worked with teams of xenobiologists and medical experts to develop treatment protocols for Kethmori injuries and illnesses, because the freed prisoners would need immediate medical attention after centuries of brutal working conditions in the crystal mines. The research showed that Kethmori bodies could regenerate from almost any injury if they were given access to certain mineral compounds that were common on their homeworlds, but completely absent from the prison colonies. As the months passed, Jake began to understand the enormous scope of what humanity was attempting, and he sometimes wondered if Captain Veltar and her crew had any idea that their simple act of kindness would lead to the largest rescue operation in galactic history. The crystal that Captain Veltar had given him still glowed on his desk in the planning center, and Jake often found himself staring at it while thinking about the gentle alien who had saved his life. Admiral Sullivan called Jake to her office 6 weeks before the planned launch date and told him that the Defense Council had voted to exclude him from the combat mission because his knowledge of Kethmori culture and language made him too valuable to risk in battle. Jake argued that he was the only human the Kethmori completely trusted and that his presence during the liberation would be crucial for coordinating with resistance forces on the ground. The argument continued for hours with Admiral Sullivan, pointing out that Jake had no military training and would be a liability in combat situations, while Jake insisted that Captain Veltar and other Kethmori leaders would only trust rescue plans that came directly from the human they had saved. Eventually, Admiral Sullivan agreed to include Jake in the mission, but only if he accepted assignment to her flagship, where he would be as safe as possible during the fighting. Captain Ben Rodriguez and the other civilian volunteers received modified cargo ships equipped with medical facilities and refugee processing centers, because the human fleet would need to evacuate millions of Kethmori prisoners immediately after the liberation and transport them to safe zones where they could receive medical treatment and decide whether to return to their homeworlds or accept sanctuary in human space. The final weeks of preparation were filled with training exercises as human soldiers learned to fight alongside Kethmori resistance fighters whose combat techniques were based on their ability to manipulate energy fields and crystal formations. The exercises revealed that humans and Kethmori fighting together were far more effective than either species fighting alone, and this discovery gave Admiral Sullivan hope that Operation Homecoming might actually succeed. Jake Morrison stood in the launch bay of Admiral Sullivan's flagship and watched the crew making final preparations for departure while thinking about Captain Veltar and wondering if she was still alive somewhere in the Zephyrian prison system. In just a few days, the human fleet would jump to hyperspace and begin the most important mission in their species' history, and Jake knew that success or failure would determine whether the kindness of one Kethmori crew would save billions of their people or lead to the destruction of two civilizations. The human fleet dropped out of hyperspace in 12 different star systems at exactly the same moment, and Admiral Kate Sullivan felt her heart racing as she watched the tactical displays showing Zephyrian patrol ships scrambling to respond to the sudden appearance of Earth forces across their prison network. Operation Homecoming had begun, and there would be no turning back from the largest rescue mission in galactic history. Admiral Sullivan's flagship led the primary assault on Kethvera Prime, where the largest Kethmori prison colony held over 2 billion crystalline aliens in mining operations that extracted the rare crystals powering the entire Zephyrian war machine. Jake Morrison stood beside her on the bridge and activated the communication system that would broadcast his message to every Kethmori receiver in the system. "This is Lieutenant Jake Morrison of the United Earth Defense Forces," Jake said into the transmitter while trying to keep his voice steady, despite the magnitude of what was happening around him. "Captain Veltar saved my life, and now we are here to save yours and the lives of all Kethmori who have suffered under Zephyrian oppression. The time of freedom has come, and humanity stands ready to fight beside you for liberation." The response from the prison colonies was immediate, as Kethmori resistance cells that had been planning for this moment began their coordinated uprising against the Zephyrian guards and security systems. On the tactical displays, Admiral Sullivan could see explosions lighting up the surface of Kethvera Prime as the prisoners used weapons and communication devices that engineer Danny Hayes had designed specifically for their crystalline physiology. Commander Lisa Park led her special operations team in a desperate assault on the primary detention facility where the most important Kethmori prisoners were held in solitary confinement under maximum security. The facility was built into the side of a mountain and protected by energy shields that could vaporize anything that tried to penetrate them. But the Kethmori resistance fighters had been sabotaging the power systems for months in preparation for this day. On Sothmar, the second largest prison world, Captain Ryan Foster's intelligence teams worked with local resistance cells to disable the control collars that kept 10 million Kethmori workers enslaved in the crystal mines. Engineer Hayes had developed a device that could disrupt the neural control signals, and within hours of the attack beginning, the prisoners had turned the mines into fortresses where they held off Zephyrian security forces while waiting for human reinforcements to arrive. Captain Ben Rodriguez commanded a fleet of converted cargo ships in a dangerous rescue operation at Velketh Station, where millions of Kethmori families were held as hostages to ensure the cooperation of workers in other facilities. The station's defenses were formidable with automated weapon systems that could destroy entire ships, but Rodriguez and his volunteer crews had hidden their weapons inside seemingly innocent cargo containers, and the Zephyrians did not realize they were under attack until it was too late to stop them. The battle for Kethvera Prime became the stuff of legend as Admiral Sullivan's fleet faced the main Zephyrian battle group in a desperate fight above the planet's surface, while Jake Morrison led the ground assault on the primary detention facility, where the most important prisoners were being held. The Zephyrian ships were fast and heavily armed, but human tactics and determination proved superior in the close combat that followed. Jake found himself running through corridors carved from solid rock, while explosions shook the mountain around. Him and Kethmori resistance fighters guided him toward the maximum security section, where Captain Veltar was being held in solitary confinement. The Zephyrian guards fought desperately to maintain control, but they had not expected coordinated attacks from both human commandos and Kethmori prisoners working together. The maximum security section was protected by force fields that could kill anyone who tried to pass through them, but Dr. Ava Torres had learned enough about Kethmori technology to create devices that could disrupt Zephyrian energy systems. Jake activated the disruptor and watched the force fields flicker and die, while alarms blared throughout the facility, and emergency lighting cast strange shadows on the walls. Jake found Captain Veltar in a cell designed to prevent her crystalline body from absorbing the energy she needed to survive, and her normally glowing form was dim with despair and exhaustion from months of torture and isolation. When she saw Jake's face, her body began to glow with renewed hope, and she spoke his name with the same musical voice he remembered from their first meeting in the crystal ship that had saved his life. "I told you my people would come," Jake said as he freed Captain Veltar from the restraints that had been slowly killing her by preventing her body from processing energy. "Humans never abandon their friends, and we have come to take you home to a galaxy where your people can live free from oppression and slavery." Captain Veltar's rescue was only the beginning as Jake and the Kethmori resistance fighters fought their way through the detention facility, freeing thousands of prisoners who had been held in solitary confinement for decades or even centuries. Many of the freed aliens were so weak they could barely stand, but they insisted on joining the fight to liberate their people from the Zephyrian guards who had tormented them for so long. Above the planet, Admiral Sullivan's fleet was winning the space battle as human ships used superior tactics and coordination to overcome Zephyrian advantages in technology and firepower. The enemy had not expected humans to risk everything for aliens they barely knew, and the surprise attack had caught the Zephyrian fleet scattered across multiple systems instead of concentrated for defense. On the other 11 prison worlds, similar battles were raging as human special forces teams worked with Kethmori resistance cells to overwhelm Zephyrian defenses and free billions of enslaved aliens who had thought they would never see freedom again. The coordination of simultaneous attacks across 12 star systems had worked perfectly, and the Zephyrians found themselves fighting desperate battles on multiple fronts without the ability to concentrate their forces or coordinate their responses. Dr. Amy Chen's medical teams were already treating injured Kethmori prisoners with the specialized medicines she had developed during the months of preparation, and the results exceeded everyone's expectations as crystalline aliens who had been near death began to recover their strength and vitality within hours of receiving proper medical care and energy supplements. Captain Rodriguez and his volunteer cargo haulers were evacuating millions of freed Kethmori from the prison worlds and transporting them to safe zones where they could receive medical treatment and make decisions about their futures without fear of recapture by Zephyrian forces. The scale of the refugee crisis was enormous, but humanity had prepared for months to handle the logistics of caring for billions of displaced aliens. Jake Morrison stood with Captain Veltar on the command deck of Admiral Sullivan's flagship and watched as the last Zephyrian ships retreated from Kethevera Prime, leaving the planet free for the first time in 3 centuries. Around them, Kethmori prisoners were celebrating their liberation, while human medical teams worked to treat the injuries and illnesses that resulted from generations of brutal working conditions. The liberation of the Kethmori prison colonies was complete, and Operation Homecoming had succeeded beyond anyone's dreams, but Jake knew that the real work was just beginning, as 2 species that had been strangers just months before would now have to build a lasting friendship based on the simple act of kindness that had started it all. The aftermath of Operation Homecoming changed the political landscape of the entire galaxy, as news of humanity's successful rescue mission spread through every civilized star system and forced other species to reconsider their assumptions about the newest members of the galactic community. The Zephyrian Empire, which had dominated this sector of space for over 1,000 years, found itself facing the loss of their primary labor force and the destruction of 3 major battle fleets in a single coordinated attack that had been planned and executed by beings they had dismissed as primitive newcomers to interstellar politics. Admiral Kate Sullivan stood in the rebuilt assembly hall on Kethvera Prime and watched Captain Veltar approach the podium where they would sign the Treaty of New Geneva, establishing the human Kethmori alliance that would reshape galactic politics for generations to come. The ceremony was being broadcast to every human world and every freed Kethmori colony, as billions of beings witnessed the beginning of a partnership based on mutual respect and shared values, rather than conquest and domination. The Zephyrian Empire had sued for peace within weeks of the liberation, as their military leadership realized that continued fighting would result in the complete destruction of their remaining forces and the possible collapse of their government. The peace negotiations had been difficult because many humans wanted the Zephyrians to pay reparations for centuries of slavery and oppression, but Captain Veltar and other Kethmori leaders had argued for forgiveness and reconciliation rather than revenge. President Carol Washington had traveled from Earth to attend the treaty signing, and she spoke about the principles that had guided humanity's decision to risk everything for aliens they had never met before. She explained that Operation Homecoming had not been motivated by political ambition or territorial expansion, but by the simple belief that all thinking beings deserved to live free from oppression and slavery. The Galactic Council, which had remained neutral during the conflict between humans and Zephyrians, had been forced to take a position when presented with evidence of the systematic enslavement of entire species across multiple star systems. The Council's formal condemnation of species-wide slavery had been unanimous, and they had established new laws prohibiting the practice throughout civilized space, with enforcement mechanisms that would prevent future atrocities. Jake Morrison had been promoted to colonel and appointed as the first human ambassador to the Kethmori Republic, but he still spent most of his time helping coordinate reconstruction efforts on the former prison worlds, where billions of freed aliens were learning to live as free beings after centuries of captivity. The work was difficult because many Kethmori had never known anything except slavery, and they needed help understanding concepts like personal choice and individual rights. Captain Ben Rodriguez and his volunteer merchant fleet had established regular supply runs between human space and the Kethmori worlds, carrying everything from medical supplies to entertainment systems, as the two species learned about each other's cultures and technologies. The trade relationships that developed from these humanitarian missions were benefiting both civilizations as Kethmori crystal technology revolutionized human space travel and communication systems. Dr. Amy Chen had established medical schools on 3 Kethmori worlds where human doctors taught Kethmori healers about advanced surgical techniques while learning about crystalline physiology and energy-based healing methods that were far more effective than traditional human medicine in treating certain types of injuries and illnesses. The exchange of medical knowledge was saving lives in both species and leading to breakthroughs that neither civilization could have achieved alone. Engineer Danny Hayes had been assigned to lead joint research projects between human and Kethmori, scientists who were developing new technologies that combined the best aspects of both civilizations' approaches to engineering and energy manipulation. The results included faster-than-light communication systems that could operate across galactic distances and defensive shields that were nearly impenetrable to conventional weapons. The reconstruction of Kethvera Prime had become a symbol of cooperation between humans and Kethmori as engineers and workers from both species labored together to build cities that incorporated the best features of crystalline architecture and human urban planning. The new capital city was a marvel of integrated design, where crystal spires reached toward the stars while gardens and parks provided spaces where beings of both species could gather and interact. Other alien civilizations had taken notice of the Human Kethmori Alliance, and many were sending diplomatic envoys to Earth and the Kethmori worlds to explore the possibility of establishing similar relationships. The Talvani, who had suffered under Zephyrian oppression for decades, were the first to request membership in the alliance, and they brought with them advanced biotechnology that complemented human engineering and Kethmori energy manipulation. The insectoid hive collectives, which had been completely isolationist for thousands of years, had opened diplomatic channels with humanity after observing the success of Operation Homecoming and learning that humans were willing to risk their lives for aliens they considered friends. The potential for trade and cultural exchange with the hive collectives was enormous because their biotechnology was centuries ahead of anything other species had developed. Jake Morrison often found himself thinking about the chain of events that had led from his rescue by Captain Veltar to the transformation of galactic politics and the liberation of billions of enslaved beings. He knew that none of it would have happened if Captain Veltar and her crew had made the safe choice and left him to die in his escape pod, but their simple act of kindness had set in motion changes that would affect the galaxy for centuries to come. President Washington presented Jake with the Medal of Valor during a ceremony attended by representatives from dozens of alien species, but Jake insisted that the real heroes were Captain Veltar and her crew, who had risked everything to save a stranger. He used his acceptance speech to announce the establishment of the Veltar Foundation, which would provide aid and support to refugees and displaced persons throughout the galaxy, regardless of their species or origin. The final scene of this chapter, in galactic history, took place on the observation deck of the newly constructed Kethvera Prime Orbital Station, where Jake and Captain Veltar stood together, watching human and Keth Mori children play in the zero-gravity gardens that had been designed as a symbol of the friendship between their peoples. The stars beyond the station seemed brighter somehow and filled with possibilities that neither species could have imagined when they were isolated and alone. "Your species is remarkable," Jake Morrison, Captain Veltar said as her crystalline body glowed with contentment and satisfaction at seeing her people free and prosperous. "We saved one human, and in return you saved us all and showed the entire galaxy what true friendship means when it requires sacrifice and courage." Jake smiled as he remembered the desperate moment in his escape pod when death had seemed certain, and he had thought that no one would ever know what had happened to the New Horizon and her passengers. "That's what friends do." "Veltar," he replied while watching the children of two species playing together, without any awareness of the barriers that had once separated their peoples. "That's what friends do." The age of human expansion into the galaxy had begun, but it was built not on conquest or domination, but on the simple principle that had guided Captain Veltar in that debris field so many months ago. Because it was right and because real friendship meant being willing to cross the galaxy, to help those who had shown kindness when it mattered most.